3 years passed. In October of 2018, Detective Jordan of the Westminster Police Department began pushing for the use of forensic genealogy on the Teree Becker case. Command staff agreed to fund the genealogy analysis through Parabon Nanolabs. LVMPD was notified that the Westminster PD was undertaking this process, hoping to solve both cases in one fell swoop. The CBI lab provided the physical evidence samples, a vaginal swab collected at Teree's autopsy, to Parabon's partner lab for preparation of a SNP profile, and the process began. Parabon's initial snapshot report to the Westminster PD was dated July 18th of 2019. The suspect who left his DNA inside Teree Becker was predicted to be white, to have hazel or brown eyes and brown or blonde hair. He had very fair skin and few freckles. His ancestry was 83% Northern European and about 13% from the Caucasus region of Europe. The suspect's raw data DNA file was uploaded to GEDmatch. As an aside here, I'm either abbreviating names or using pseudonyms to protect these individuals' privacy. The top match was identified as Jana M. of El Paso, Texas. She shared 91.9 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with the suspect, consistent with a 6th to 9th degree relationship, most likely a second cousin once removed or a third cousin. Parabon determined through email exchanges with Jana that she was adopted and had identified the maternal side of her biological family. She had gathered some information on the paternal side of her pedigree and provided that information to Parabon. The second top match was listed as Sally Waterbury of Las Vegas. Sally shared 87 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with the suspect. Sally was likely a second cousin once removed or third cousin to the suspect, but there was the connection to Las Vegas. There were 3 more significant genetic matches that Parabon noted in their report. The third top match was L.C. Sullivan of San Leandro, California, who shared 62 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with the suspect. The fourth match was Kim I. of Gloucester, Virginia, who shared 60 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with the suspect. Unfortunately, Kim was an adoptee and had not been able to locate her biological parents. The Parabon genealogist contacted Kim, and she agreed to assist the investigation, and Parabon agreed to help her figure out who her parents were. The genealogist was able to provide answers to Kim and at the same time gather additional data points to inform her ongoing analysis. And finally, Jana's maternal half-sister Cherrie of Midland, Texas, shared 26 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with the suspect. The knowledge that the suspect shared DNA with Jana's maternal side of her pedigree meant that the suspect was likely connected to that side of her family, and that Jana's and Cherrie's maternal ancestry should be the focus of the research. Shared DNA among the genetic matches was also used as a helpful tool. For example, the second match, Sally Waterbury, and the 12th match, Chad D., shared 350 centimorgans of DNA. Jana also shared a minute amount of DNA with Chad, but didn't share any with Sally, the second match. In this way, the genealogist was able to determine the different, unrelated branches of the suspect's family tree. The next step was to figure out where they intersected in a most recent common ancestor. The genealogist was able to trace the lineage of the adoptee Kim I and her relative, match number 7 Jason C. They both descended from the marriage of Islam McLam and Elizabeth Tart, born in the late 1700s. This defined genetic network number 1, aka one branch of the suspect's family tree. Islam and Elizabeth had a daughter, Elizabeth, and a son, William. Unfortunately, this son, William, married 3 times and had multiple children with these wives. And when I say multiple, I mean 28. 28 children. Tracing and documenting each of these children and their descendants over 200 plus years was an onerous and time-consuming task. Genetic network number 2 was clarified because research determined that match number 2, Sally Waterbury, and match number 12, Chad D., were first cousins once removed through Sally's paternal line. Clifton Waterbury and Ruth Swanson were her grandparents, and Chad's great-grandparents. But the genealogist hit a roadblock here because Sally and Chad were both somewhat distantly related to the suspect, so their connection to him was likely further back in the family line, to relationships predating Clifton Waterbury and Ruth Swanson's marriage. The genealogist was able to define a third genetic network traceable to the Skaggs family from Greene County, Kentucky. Numerous lower-level matches were members of this genetic network and were descended from the marriage of William Skaggs and Mary Catherine Long in the early 1800s. the genealogist turned to her top match, Jana M. Jana provided the information that her birth mother was Geraldine S. of New Mexico. Remember that Jana's maternal half-sister Shelley also shared DNA with the suspect, meaning he was related to Jana and Shelley through their mother, Geraldine. Since the genealogist knew, based on the shared levels of DNA, that the suspect was likely a second cousin once removed or a third cousin to Jana and her half-sister Shelley on their mom's side, she started looking at descendants of Jana and Shelley's maternal great-great-grandparents. The suspect also had to be descended from them. However, no connections were found to anyone living near Westminster, Colorado, or Las Vegas, and no other genetic matches were apparently connected to this descendancy line. Now the genealogist turned back to top match number 2, Sally Waterbury, suspected to be a second cousin once removed or third cousin to the suspect. Unfortunately, the genealogist hit a brick wall here as well, unable to find any triangulation to other DNA matches or people who lived near Westminster, Colorado, or Las Vegas. The same was the case for research on genetic network number 1, the descendants of William McLamb, the guy with 28 kids. Again, the genealogist was unable to find a triangulation to any other DNA matches or anybody who lived near either of the crimes. So Parabon's initial report recommended a couple of next steps. One was to upload the suspect's SNP profile to family tree DNA, which had not been done, and which had only recently been made an option available to law enforcement. Additional helpful matches might be located in that database. Second, it was recommended that the Westminster PD check their suspect list for the 30 surnames that Parabon had come across while researching the suspect's genetic relatives. Finally, Parabon recommended reference testing of 2 individuals to help focus the investigation, one on each of the paternal grandparent lines, Waterbury and Swanson, of match number 2, Sally. In the alternative, if these people had already tested using a private commercial testing company, if they would agree to upload to an open-source database and opt in, the data could be very useful in narrowing the focus as well. Both recommended reference testers were males, but both were in positions within their documented family trees that they were extremely unlikely to be the suspect. While all this was going on, Westminster Police Detective Von Felt reviewed Parabon's list of 30 surnames that could be related to the suspect in Teree Becker's case. He scanned the entire 3,074-page case file and found one man who had been discussed whose name was Harvey W. Harvey's last name was one of the 30 surnames in the Parabon report. You might recall that Harvey was the black man arrested for marijuana possession and carrying a switchblade, and he was found to be driving a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. He had taken a polygraph exam and the results were inconclusive. Now, in 2019, Detective Von Felt looked into Harvey's arrest record, which was quite significant in Louisiana, Colorado, and Texas. He had multiple arrests for battery, criminal trespass, theft, assault, possession of controlled substances, resisting arrest, and illegal weapons. Harvey was now living in Texas, and he sure sounded like a promising suspect. Detective Von Felt called up Parabon and asked whether they had any information on the race of the suspect. Parabon informed him that the suspect was a white male with brown eyes and likely brown hair. And that was the end of the Harvey W. lead, who, you'll recall, was black. Back to the genealogy. Detective Von Felt was put in contact with cold case homicide investigator Ken Hefner of the LVMPD in August of 2019. Hefner agreed to assist in the joint investigation using Parabon, and that the LVMPD would shoulder some of the expense, since the analysis would benefit both agencies. On August 14th, Westminster Police Detective Von Felt met with supervisors and members from the CBI to discuss Parabon's recommendations. They agreed to try to obtain a reference sample from an Edgar Waterbury. Detective Von Felt contacted a detective in Green Bank, Washington, and asked him to assist in getting a voluntary DNA sample from Edgar. Detective Gene Martin with the Island County Sheriff's Office made contact with Edgar and explained what the purpose of their investigation was. Edgar agreed to give a DNA sample using a commercial DNA test kit. Then the results were uploaded by Edgar to GEDmatch so Parabon's genealogist could compare them directly to the unknown suspect. The results showed that Sally Waterbury's first cousin once removed, Edgar Waterbury, was also related to the suspect. This confirmed that the relationship to the suspect was on the paternal grandfather Waterbury's side of Sally's family. a brand new match who had recently uploaded helped narrow the focus to common ancestors Squire Waterbury and Betsy Jones, who married in the late 1700s in Westchester, New York. The suspect was very likely also descended from this ancestral couple. I'm happy to announce that DNA ID will be on Podcast Row at CrimeCon again this year. Last year, I met so many amazing listeners who stopped by my booth to say hello. And I met several incredible members of law enforcement, 2 of whom brought me cases that I ended up covering in Season 4. CrimeCon 2025 is taking place in Aurora, Colorado on September 5th, 6th, and 7th, and I really hope to see you there. Please make sure you use my voucher, DNA ID, all one word, at checkout when you purchase your badge to save 10%. That's real savings. Again, DNA ID, all one word, in the voucher box at checkout to save 10% on your badge. See you in the Rockies. The Westminster Police decided to proceed with the recommended upload to Family Tree DNA. This was accomplished on January 30th, 2020. The top match there shared 522 centimorgans of DNA with the suspect. This was a very promising amount of DNA, likely a first cousin once removed to the suspect. However, it was immediately suspected that the kit manager had uploaded a kit for someone else, as both the name and the email address on the DNA profile belonged to a female I'll call Denise. But the DNA tester profile was showing as male and included a Y DNA haplogroup on his profile, indicating that he had taken both a Y DNA test and an autosomal DNA test. They had to find out who he was. Since it's relatively common for a kit manager to accidentally label a kit they are managing with their own name, Parabon posited that the actual DNA tester might be a husband, father, son, or brother to Denise. Unfortunately, despite extensive research of Denise's immediate family members, Parabon found no men in Denise's tree who connected to any other known genetic networks. They posited that it was possible a misattributed parentage event might be shrouding the true connections, or she may have been managing a kit for a male who had no genetic connection to her family. Of course, a DNA relative sharing this much DNA with the suspect, 522 centimorgans, could be risky to reach out to, as they could be anticipated to be in touch with their close relative, the killer. But in this case, it was felt that contacting Denise might be the only way to determine the true identity of the top match, so Parabon recommended that law enforcement do so. This gets very confusing, so bear with me. When Westminster police detectives contacted Denise, she told them that the DNA tester was her stepfather, James F. However, this did not add up with what the genealogist was seeing in the family trees she had built, and with a lot more digging, she figured out what had happened. Denise had inadvertently switched DNA results when uploading to Family Tree DNA. She had originally tested her stepfather James F's Y DNA, his direct male line, with Family Tree DNA. Many years later, she tested her own autosomal DNA at a different site. When she later attempted to upload her autosomal DNA file to Family Tree DNA, she accidentally added it to her stepfather's existing Family Tree DNA profile and relabeled it with her own name instead of creating a new profile. So, the Family Tree DNA profile was automatically assigned to be male by the system since it included Y DNA test results. But the autosomal DNA, which was added to the profile, was actually Denise's own very not male DNA. It was an unfortunate loophole that even Family Tree DNA had not considered possible. The genealogist assisted Denise in uploading her autosomal DNA file from a different testing company to GEDmatch, which proved it was an identical file to the one at Family Tree DNA. This from Parabon's report, quote, "A check of Denise's Family Tree DNA account order history verified there was an autosomal DNA transfer from another source on September 20th of 2015. So while Denise believes she tested James F's DNA directly with Family Tree DNA and does not remember transferring results between testing companies, it appears she actually did so," end quote. As you can hear, sorting out this confusing mix-up proved to be incredibly vexing and time-consuming. And after all that, the top match turned out to be Denise herself. And she would prove to be the key to the whole thing. Denise and the suspect were approximately first cousins, or more likely, first cousins once removed. Furthermore, Denise's mother Dorothy had also tested and proved to share no DNA with the suspect, which meant that Denise was related to the suspect along her paternal line. Denise provided the name of her known biological father, John F. Graham, whom the genealogist had not previously been aware of since Denise was raised from a very young age by her stepfather and had taken his surname. John Graham's maternal side was built out and quickly provided the connection to the Skaggs family from Greene County, Kentucky, which comprised genetic network number 3. They were descended from the marriage of William Skaggs and Catherine Long. But what about the other genetic networks? Denise shared 63 centimorgans of DNA with the original top match, Jana M., and 59 centimorgans with her sister Shelley. Their maternal grandfather, Buford Shaver, had been born in Talihina, Oklahoma, which was the very same tiny town in which Denise's paternal grandfather, Walter Graham Sr., was born. The population at the time was 500 people, so this connection was assumed not to be a coincidence. Another quote from Parabon: "The 1910 census from Talihina, Oklahoma, shows that Denise's great-great-grandparents, John and Martha Graham, were living directly next door to Jana's great-grandparents, Edgar Shaver and Francis Wilson. Based on the genetic and circumstantial evidence, the analyst believes that Jana's grandfather Buford Shaver's biological father was likely born a Graham, rather than the son of his Shaver father of record. This would make Jana and Shelley half-second cousins to Denise, which is consistent with the amount of DNA that they share. The suspect was likely to be a paternal first cousin once removed, or much less likely a first cousin to Denise, and both descended from the marriages of Denise's paternal great-grandfather, Augustus Graham, to Sadie McDuffie, and her other paternal great-grandfather, William Dodd, to Nora Linville." End quote. Despite having all this information, the Parabon genealogist was once again stuck. The suspect was most likely a first cousin once removed to Denise, but there was no one in the family tree who fit that description, because Denise had no known first cousins who were old enough to be his parents. None of the other statistically possible relationships fit either, as the only male first cousin Denise had who was eligible was not living anywhere near Colorado and was very, very young at the time of Teree Becker's murder. So someone was missing from Denise's family tree, and it was crucial that they find him. Denise's biological father was John F. Graham. The genealogist looked at his siblings, Denise's aunts and uncles, to try to identify any sons they might have had who were the right age and lived in Denver or in Las Vegas in the appropriate timeframes. These men would be first cousins or half-first cousins to Denise. One of John's siblings was Walter Raleigh Graham Jr., born in 1932, who had been married twice, but did not appear to have any biological children according to his obituary. The other sibling was Elizabeth Ann Graham, who had multiple children with husbands Jack Vara Jr. and Norman Marvin Benson. One of these, Ken Vara, was a first cousin to Debbie, but had no apparent connections to the Waterbury genetic network, which must be linked in here somehow. Once again, they needed more information. Parabon recommended reference testing among members of Denise's extended family, the relatives of Walter Graham Jr. and Elizabeth Graham, to see how they connected to Denise and to the suspect. This from the Westminster Police Report. In September 2020, the Westminster Police started consulting with the CBI on the genealogy. An analyst at the CBI reviewed the Parabon report dated August 25, 2020, looked at the family tree for Denise, and agreed with Parabon's recommendations for reference testing. The investigators contacted and tested two of Denise's half-sisters, which didn't provide much additional information, but did rule out her cousin, Ken Vara, as the suspect. During this time, in January 2021, Detective Von Felt retired, and the Teree Becker case was assigned to Detective Steve Sanders. Pursuing the recommendation to contact relatives of siblings of Walter Jr. and Elizabeth Graham, criminalist Chandra Thurston and the CBI worked on building out the family tree of Denise's relatives. They were looking more closely at her uncle, Walter Graham Jr. A male child born to Walter Jr. would be in the right position to be the killer. And they found someone who could help. Despite no biological children being listed in his obituary, Walter Jr. actually had 3 biological children, including a daughter named Brenda, who was still alive. Brenda was Denise's paternal first cousin. In May of 2021, Detective Sanders and Ms. Thurston interviewed Brenda. When they asked her about her father, Walter Graham Jr., she told them he wasn't a big part of her life. She had virtually no contact with him. She knew nothing about his life prior to his marriage to her mother, but she did know that he had been in and out of prison and, according to her mother, was an abusive and bad man. Brenda agreed to give a DNA sample. Kinship testing was conducted between Brenda's sample and that of the suspect. They were found to share 1,588 centimorgans of autosomal DNA. Brenda was also found to share 847 centimorgans of autosomal DNA with Denise, whose birth surname was Graham, and 43 centimorgans of X-DNA, which is consistent with their known relationship of paternal first cousins. Using the shared DNA amounts and the estimated birth date range for the suspect of 1949 to 1958, Parabon was able to rule out that the suspect was Brenda's grandparent, nephew, or uncle. That meant he could only be a half-sibling or a double first cousin. A double first cousin was possible because Brenda did have a paternal aunt, Elizabeth Graham, who had married one of her maternal uncles, John Vara. So Brenda had known double first cousins in her family. However, she and the suspect did not share so-called fully identical segments of DNA that double first cousins would be expected to share. Further, their DNA match lists were not similar, which they would be if they shared both sets of grandparents. This left only a half-sibling as the relationship between Brenda and the suspect. The suspect must be Brenda's half-brother. Walter Raleigh Graham Jr. was their shared father. As Ms. Thurston's report says, the testing of Brenda, quote, helped confirm that Walter Graham Jr. was the father to our suspect. But they still didn't know who the suspect was. Brenda didn't know of any half-brothers, and Walter Jr. had no sons of record that the genealogist could locate who were the right age to be the suspect. A quote from Parabon's report, "No record of any prior marriage was found for Walter during the late 1940s or 1950s. Whether Walter was married or not, it's likely that Walter had a son sometime in the 1949 to 1958 time range who is the unknown suspect. It may be very difficult to identify him unless some documentary evidence is found of his existence." Parabon recommended continued work to identify and interview the extended family of Walter Raleigh Graham Jr. to try to name any women he was involved with, whom he might have had a male child with, and to connect that child to the Waterbury-Jones genetic network, anchored on the marriage of Squire Waterbury and Betsy Jones in the late 1700s, and suspected to represent the maternal side of the suspect's family tree. The genealogist also recommended in-person research at the Denver Library, since the historical Denver newspapers of the relevant time period were not yet available online, and it was very likely that Walter R. Graham's additional marriages or children may have been detailed in birth or marriage announcements. With COVID restrictions still in place and many years of unindexed birth and marriage announcements to search via microfiche, this was not practical at the time. So research pivoted to the maternal side of the suspect's family. This is from analyst Chandra Thurston's report. Quote, "Over the next several months, research was done in attempts to locate or identify possible suspects within the Waterbury family tree. A possible suspect with the name Jeffrey D. was developed. Jeffrey's mother was Cheryl Waterbury. Jeffrey had grown up in Colorado and married and lived as an adult in Las Vegas. He was the right age and lived in the right locations. Investigators looked into Jeffrey, but could not connect him to a Volkswagen Beetle or anyone in the Graham family. Nonetheless, in May of 2022, Detective Sanders made arrangements with the FBI in Bakersfield, California, to do a surreptitious grab of Jeffrey's DNA. California Highway Patrol Officer Ryan Smith, who was assigned to the FBI's Safe Streets Task Force in Bakersfield, collected a used cigarette butt Jeffrey discarded and swabbed the door handle of his vehicle. The items were tested at the CBI lab and proved that Jeffrey's DNA was not a match to the suspect DNA. In August of 2022, the Westminster Police Department began consulting with a local genealogy company called Solved by DNA. Solved by DNA had worked with CBI successfully on previous cases, and the genealogist, Michelle Kennedy, also a crime analyst supervisor for the Douglas County Sheriff's Office, agreed to take on the genealogy analysis pro bono. Ms. Kennedy started with what the Westminster authorities gave her, the name of the suspected father of the suspect, named Walter Raleigh Graham Jr. They didn't know who the suspect was, and to find him, Ms. Kennedy set out to figure out who his mother was. First, in researching Walter Graham Jr., Ms. Kennedy benefited from the very recent digitizing of the Denver Post and learned from an article about him in the new online database that he had been married 3 times in the time frame 1950 to 1955. she suspected that one of these marriages must have produced a son. Moving to the suspect's maternal side to figure out where it intersected with Walter R. Graham Jr., she started out with the ancestral couple known to be the maternal ancestors of the suspect, Squire Waterbury and his wife Betsy Jones. Ms. Kennedy's research benefited from the release of the 1950 federal census data on April 1, 2022. For those of you who don't know this, the census is an incredibly important trove of information for genealogists and historical researchers, as it provides names, ages, addresses, professions, and household members of everyone throughout the United States. But the census data is released only after 72 years have elapsed, a period longer than the average lifespan, in order to protect individual privacy interests. Ms. Kennedy's report, dated August 30, 2022, focused on the maternal line of the suspect's DNA, which had been traced back to Squire Waterbury and his marriage to Betsy Jones through the top match in this genetic network, 87 centimorgan match Sally Waterbury. They also had two lesser DNA matches who were part of the Waterbury-Jones genetic network. Ms. Kennedy also noted from public trees online that some of the lower-level centimorgan matches to the suspect were descended from two other couples with the surnames Mudgett and Mullins. She built out all the family trees to try to locate union couples where these matches all intersected, and her descendancy work located two Waterbury descendants who had married Mudgett descendants. And for the first time in all the research, one of these people had a connection to Colorado. David Waterbury and his wife Lily Hale, whose mother was a Mudgett, had a grandson named David West who had died in Westminster, Colorado. Westminster, Colorado was the exact town where Teree Becker had been found murdered. The genealogist knew she had hit pay dirt. David West had married an Angela Pruss, and they had two daughters and a son. Ms. Kennedy focused on the daughters and found something when she was researching daughter Nancy. A Social Security Death Index report indicated that Nancy had registered a new surname, Graham, in 1951. According to a tiny blurb in the Colorado transcript on October 26, 1950, David and Angela's daughter, Nancy West, descended from the Waterburys, had married a man named Walter R. Graham in October of 1950, tying in another genetic network. The genealogist knew from the article she had found earlier about Walter Graham Jr. that he had been sent to prison before this marriage, and the address given for him in the marriage announcement was in Buena Vista, Colorado, where a prison is located. And according to a January 1951 birth announcement in the Denver Post, which again had only very recently been digitized, Walter Graham had a son in December of 1950. No mother was listed, but the address listed in the birth announcement was the same address listed for Walter Graham in the 1950 census, which was just a few miles from where 16-year-old Nancy lived with her parents in Denver. There was a lot pointing to Nancy and Walter having had a son together. The genealogist wanted to know who this son was. He could be the missing person in the family tree, half-brother to Brenda, who was the suspect. Nancy had gone on to divorce Walter Graham and had remarried a man named James Elliott. According to official documents, Nancy had two sons of record, Edward Michael Elliott, born 1958, and Thomas Martin Elliott. Thomas Martin Elliott, though, was born in December 1950. His mother had married Walter Graham 2 months earlier. The genealogist concluded that Thomas Elliott was likely born Thomas Graham. His bio-father was Walter Graham, and his birth record, located by CBI, showed that he was adopted by Nancy's second husband, James Elliott, in 1960. Solved by DNA's report says, quote, based on this information, Thomas Elliott is likely a son of Walter Graham Jr. and therefore a half-brother to Brenda, matching the criteria for the suspect in this case, end quote. Thomas's birth name of Graham had been dropped, which was why the genealogist had been unable to link him to the family tree. But now it all fit. They just had to confirm their theory. But Thomas Elliott had no known biological children and no close relatives who were still living, other than his half-sister Brenda, whose DNA they already had. It wasn't enough. They wanted to be sure. There was only one option left to prove that Thomas Elliott was the man the investigators had been searching for all those years. They dug him up. Investigators determined that Thomas Elliott's remains were buried at the Southern Nevada Veterans Memorial Cemetery, located at 1900 Veterans Memorial Boulevard in Boulder City, Nevada. He was buried as a veteran due to a short enlistment he had with the military, in which he served in Vietnam as a private in the U.S. Marine Corps, according to his headstone. He was in a marked grave in the northeast portion of the cemetery in Section BB, Plot 488. On October 15, 2023, Detective M. Dosh obtained a court order from Judge Jones authorizing the exhumation of the remains. On October 5th, at 2023, at 6:50 a.m., a number of persons arrived at the Veterans Memorial Cemetery for the exhumation. On hand were CSI L. Alexander, Executive Director K. Murga, Crime Scene Investigations Director K. Gramis, Homicide Detective M. Dosh, Homicide Sergeants M. Downing and J. Patton, Westminster Detective Steve Sanders and Senior Criminalist Chandra Thurston, representatives of Davis Mortuary, and the 5-person ground crew of Veterans Memorial Cemetery. The grounds crew started the excavation and found that the wooden casket was no more. After decades of being in the sodden ground, it had collapsed inward. The cemetery workers had to dig carefully by hand until they could see a skull, and they dusted off some of the dirt. And there Elliott lay, in a suit, a pair of eyeglasses next to his head. The CSIs collected the skull and cut the suit pants on one leg to seize the femur bone. These were transported to the LVMPD lab in preparation to be sent to Bodie Labs for processing. On December 13, 2023, Bodie Technology reported that they had successfully extracted an STR and YSTR profile from the femur bone of Thomas Elliott. The profile was used independently by both the LVMPD and the CBI to identify Elliott as a match to both profiles developed from the evidence in the possession of both agencies. In Colorado, the DNA was compared to DNA previously collected from a vaginal swab from Teree Becker, and the report found strong support to indicate the DNA found in Teree Becker's vaginal swab came from Thomas Elliott. The statistics in Terry's case were impressive. Quote, the single-source DNA profile previously developed from the sperm fraction of the tube of extracted DNA sperm fraction of the vaginal swab is approximately 24 septillion times more likely to be observed if it originated from Thomas Elliott than if it originated from an unknown, unrelated individual. Detective Steve Sanders in Westminster wrote, quote, based on the facts gathered during this investigation, Thomas Elliott has been identified as the suspect in this case. As he is deceased, I recommend this case be cleared exceptionally by death of the offender. In the Las Vegas case, Elliott was matched to the sperm fraction of vaginal swabs taken during Cherrie Bridgewater's autopsy via the sexual assault kit. My report from the LVMPD perplexingly redacted the statistical results portion. The part I was able to read says, quote, based on the DNA findings, Elliott is confirmed as the suspect in Bridgewater's murder. So who was this guy who had proved so difficult to identify? Thomas Martin Graham was born December 14, 1950, to Walter Graham Jr. and Nancy West. Nancy West divorced Walter Graham and in 1956 married James A. Elliott, who 4 years later adopted Thomas and changed his last name, greatly confusing the genealogy analysis. The Colorado and Las Vegas investigators gathered a lot of information on Elliott, who had a significant criminal history in their states. Elliott was a career criminal who spent a large portion of his life in and out of the prison system. The first arrest on record was on March 8th of 1970, when he was charged with contributing to the delinquency of a minor in Bartow, Florida. Next, he turned up in Denver, where he was arrested by Denver PD on November 9th, 1971, for possession of narcotics. Another arrest by the same agency followed on the 24th of November for burglary. He was then arrested in February of 1972 by Denver PD for something involving him being a fugitive. Another arrest in April 1972 followed for the same thing. Then he was arrested in Golden, Colorado on July 9, 1972 for felony theft, and the same day was charged by the Brighton County Sheriff's Office for theft. Remember that Brighton, Colorado was where Teree Becker was last seen alive. Then Elliott was arrested in December of 1972 for distribution of heroin and cocaine. It's hard to fathom how little jail time he did for all these crimes, because once again he was out and was arrested in May 1973 for possession of a burglary tool in Buena Vista, Colorado. We know that he killed Teree on December 4th, 5th, or 6th, 1975, but was never charged. He was arrested just 11 days after he killed Teree for a second-degree burglary he had committed in Lakewood, Colorado on December 5th. Like a genius, he'd left his fingerprints at the scene. This conviction finally got him sentenced in March of 1976 to 7 to 11 years in prison in Cannon City. He would serve 5 years or so and then was transferred interstate throughout the Department of Corrections system, moving to a prison in Nevada in July 1977. I'm sure Colorado was happy to be rid of him, but Nevada was unfortunate that he ended up being released from prison in Las Vegas in January 1981. Because on June 9th, 1981, in Carson City, he committed a burglary with intent to commit a crime which was listed as a forcible child rape of a 13-year-old girl. This time he got life with the possibility of parole, but he must have behaved himself because he served only 10 years and was released in February 1991 in Las Vegas, where he promptly killed Cherrie Bridgewater that May. Elliott had a listed Las Vegas address in May 1991 of 5446 Spencer. This was about 10 miles from where Cherrie Bridgewater was killed. We know that he remarried, and I don't know whether investigators have contacted his wife from back then. But we do know that on October 30th, 1991, Thomas Elliott was found dead in his truck in a parking lot on the 5300 block of South Nellis Boulevard in Las Vegas. He had a deep cut in his arm and had bled to death in an apparent suicide. A bloody knife was found next to him. According to notes from the original coroner's investigation into his death, Elliott's wife at the time stated he had recently tested positive for drugs, and this positive test was a violation of his probation and would likely send him back to prison. Apparently, death was preferable. Elliott's obituary from the Las Vegas Review-Journal on November 4th, 1991 reads as follows. Thomas Martin Elliott, 40, died Wednesday. He was a 15-year resident of Las Vegas. I'd like to point out that a bunch of that time was in prison. Anyway, a Marine Corps veteran, he was born December 14th, 1950 in Denver, and was an electrician and member of Alcoholics Anonymous. He is survived by his wife, who I'm not naming, and his daughter and his son, all of Las Vegas. Also his mother, Nancy, of Sterling, Colorado, and his brother of Oregon. And there's the clue right in his obituary. Thomas Elliott was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous in Las Vegas. And so was Cherrie Bridgewater. And that's how investigators think they met. They believe that Elliott and Cherrie were friends, or at least acquaintances, and that Cherrie allowed him into her apartment. Suspicions are that they met at AA, and Cherrie likely trusted Elliott as a fellow chapter member and devoted sober living colleague. And there's potentially some evidence of this. Think way back to the Cherrie Bridgewater investigation, when the detectives interviewed John about men Cherrie might have dated. He mentioned 3 boyfriends of Cherrie's, Paul, Frank, and Tom. Could Tom be Thomas Elliott? John had even met this Tom and described him as a white guy about 5'10" to 5'11", which fits the description of Thomas Elliott, who was 5'11" and most definitely white. Cherrie had told John things between her and Tom were very casual, nothing serious, but they weren't nothing either. If Thomas Elliott was indeed Tom, who was close enough with Cherrie that her friend John had been introduced to him, then Cherrie would definitely have opened her door to him. He might have even known about the potent medication she took at night that knocked her out and taken advantage of that. And how did Elliott meet Teree Becker? I think she was hitchhiking back to Denver from visiting her boyfriend, Teree D. in Brighton, and Thomas Elliott stopped and picked her up. Teree was missing for at least a day before she was found. Perhaps 15 years before he was in AA in Las Vegas, Elliott was a drinker, and the two drank together somewhere before he killed Teree. But remember the date on which we know Thomas Elliott burgled a house in Lakewood. It was December 5th, 1976. Teree was still missing on that date. She may very well have still been alive, and investigators have theorized may even have been an accomplice to that burglary. Remember, Teree needed money to bail Teree D. out of jail. She wasn't above breaking the law, as we know. And when police arrested Thomas Elliott for this burglary, and he confessed, he told them that he had been brought to the home that he burglarized by a woman named Trish. They stole items of electronics and other valuables. Investigators wonder whether Trish could possibly have been Teree. They later found out that the home Elliott burglarized was actually owned by some acquaintances of his, whom he knew were going to be at a concert that night. So the burglary was basically risk-free. Could he have brought Teree along as an accomplice and then killed her to avoid splitting the profits? It was certainly not out of the question. And of course, when Elliot was arrested and mentioned a female accomplice, he would never have given them Teree's real name, since he had left her slain in a field just a few days earlier. Another question that we have not been able to resolve is, assuming Elliot picked Teree up hitchhiking, whose car was he driving? When he was arrested 12 days after the burglary, he did not own a vehicle. He admitted to police that he had hitchhiked to the burglary and been picked up by someone. But he certainly must have had access to a vehicle in order to deposit Teree in the field where she was found. Had he borrowed a friend's car? Police investigating the burglary in Lakewood do not seem to have been able to shed any light on the question of what vehicle Thomas Elliot might have been driving. I think it's interesting that throughout all these reports and genealogy, we learned that Thomas Elliot, who was born a Graham, had a dark family history. His real father was named Walter Graham Jr., and his grandfather was Walter Graham Sr. Both Walter Grahams were known to have done prison time. Walter Jr., Thomas's bio-father, was married 3 times in 5 years and was written up in the Denver Post on March 10, 1955, for being a ringleader of an 11-member burglary, forgery, and check fraud ring that had defrauded area business owners out of $12,000 in 5 months. He was sentenced to 2 to 7 years for his involvement in this scheme. Investigators don't believe Thomas spent any time with his father, whose parents married when Walter Graham Jr. was already in prison. His mother, Nancy, was only 16 and married 3 times herself, so it's unclear how stable of a home he had as a child. But maybe he inherited his father and grandfather's criminal tendencies and went on to become the worst offender in the family, with 2 known murders and a child rape under his belt. Just a bad seed. Speaking of child rape, I probably don't need to point out that if Thomas Elliot had been given a harsher sentence for his rape of the 13-year-old Carson City, Nevada girl, he would not have been walking around free to murder Cherrie Bridgewater, which he did within 3 months of being released. Teree and Cherrie's cases have some remarkable similarities, and not just because their names rhyme. They were both killed the same way. In Teree's case, they thought her t-shirt might have been used to strangle or asphyxiate her. In Cherrie's case, a cord was used. But that time, Elliot tied the cord ends in a nice little bow, indicating either that he cared for Cherrie, or more likely, in my opinion, that it was a little FU to the cops. Cherrie and Teree both had spent time in jail and were either dependent on alcohol or recovering from addiction. Both were alone and vulnerable. Teree was hitchhiking, and Cherrie was living alone in an apartment in a crimey area. And the women looked similar, with their wavy hair, square jaws, fair skin, and large eyeglasses. No doubt Thomas Elliot picked up Teree Becker hitchhiking and seemed nice enough. He might have even plied her with alcohol before turning on her. Remember that she vanished on the 4th and was found on the 6th, dead for only several hours. In Cherrie's case, I think he befriended her at AA. Perhaps they bonded over both of them formerly living in the Denver area. She was into him enough that she mentioned her friend Tom to John and even introduced them. Then Tom manufactured a reason to visit her at her apartment, and the rest is history. This is not the first time I have felt that investigators perhaps should have looked into recently released prisoners as part of their murder investigation. So many of these guys reoffend as soon as they are released. If that had been done in Cherrie's case, they might have noted that her AA friend Tom had recently spent 10 years in prison for a violent rape, and maybe he would not have gotten away with her murder. As for whether Thomas Elliot is responsible for any other crimes, at a January 31st, 2024 press conference held by the LV MPD announcing the solve of the 2 homicides in 2 different states, Homicide Lieutenant Jason Johansson told the assembled media that they were in the process of reviewing old Nevada cases to see if Elliot could be responsible, but they didn't believe he had committed any more crimes in their jurisdiction. Elliot was, after all, only a free man in Nevada for 6 months in 1981, and from February to November 1991, when he took his own life. Lieutenant Johansson expressed some sadness at the timing of the case resolution. He said, "Unfortunately, Cherrie's mother and father passed away. If you go back over the case file, you can see that her dad was very interested in making sure his daughter's case was solved. I wish that I could say we had a chance to solve it while he was alive. My investigator that worked this case did have an opportunity to communicate with both of her sons. Both of them are still alive. We were able to communicate with them." Lieutenant Johansson made clear that Cherrie's case is now closed by an exceptional clearance suspect deceased. He said the solve was truly a collaborative effort, thanks to the involvement of Parabon Nanolabs, Solved by DNA, the CBI, the Westminster Police Department, and the LVMPD. Westminster Police issued a press release saying, "We are thrilled we were able to solve this cold case and hopefully bring closure to the friends and family of Teree Becker." After 48 and 33 years respectively, the cases of Teree Becker and Cherrie Bridgewater are closed thanks to investigative genetic genealogy. And if you're one of the bad guys, they are coming for you. Thank you to Chandra Thurston of the Westminster Police for speaking with me about this case, and to my genealogy friends, as always. I'd like to take a moment to remind all DNA ID listeners of the option to join Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can listen to every episode of DNA ID ad-free. You can also direct message with Jess and Mike and comment on the episodes along with other patrons. And Patreon is the only place where we will post crime scene photos as appropriate. Patreon dollars are used to fund the expenses incurred in making this show, obtaining police reports, procuring court documents, and keeping research database subscriptions up to date. We could not create the show without the support of our patrons, so please consider joining today. Thank you. Recently, I let listeners know about a new benefit available to them called an AbJack Insider subscription that's available through Apple Podcasts. An AbJack Insider subscription will give listeners ad-free access to every bit of DNA ID content published, both past episodes and future episodes. It will also give you benefits like early access and bonus content. Head over to Apple Podcasts and click on the DNA ID show page or the AbJack Entertainment channel to start a free trial. Thanks for listening to this episode of DNA ID. If you'd like to listen to the show ad-free and help support the show in the process, please head over to patreon.com/DNAID. And if you're interested in some fun DNA ID merch, visit the store at customizedgirl.com/s/DNAID podcast. To contact the show, please email us at dnaidpodcast@gmail.com. Follow us on social media at DNAID Podcast on Instagram, at DNAID Podcast on Twitter, or on Facebook at facebook.com/DNAID Podcast. Finally, if you want to visit our website, go to dnaidpodcast.com. You'll be able to get all the episodes of the show, leave comments on episodes that I can respond to, and you can even leave voicemails. You'll get all the latest news about the show and important updates. Find links to our social media, merch, and a lot more. It's really your one-stop shop for everything DNA ID. DNA ID is written, researched, and hosted by me, Jessica Betancourt. It's produced by me and Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Music by Connor Betancourt. Check out our other collaborative podcasts, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons, and Beyond Bizarre True Crime.